Hi. So I wanted to talk about the free will paradox and continue our discussion. And I wanted to give you some arguments as to why we might think that each of these are true. So last time I went through and kind of briefly explained what they were, and in my explanation I gave some reasons as to why we might think that they're true. But let me take a few minutes to talk about some reasons and arguments as to why each of them are true. And the reason I want to do that is because then when it comes to us deciding which one we're going to reject, we also have to reject the reasons that are given for thinking that it's true. And you're going to see that these are going to play off of each other, because once we reject one of these three theses, which we have to do on pain of contradiction, it's going to define our position on the free will debate. So let me give you a few reasons of why we should think these are true. For the first one, the free will thesis, the agents sometimes act freely. I briefly went over some reasons why you might think of them last time, but I didn't really lay them out, just kind of appealed to your intuition. But we've got two reasons. One is that we feel free. And I'm going to write two up here and then come back to it. So the first one is we feel free. So this is just an appeal to your intuition about how you feel when you're going about your day. So when you go to the coffee shop and you're about to pick whether you want a really expensive cup of coffee or the really cheap cup of coffee, or you want water or whatever you want, we often feel like there's a moment of decision. Again, because the free will thesis says sometimes agents act freely. It's not like you feel free at every moment. I mean, if you do, great, but usually you don't. It's that in those moments when you think you are making a free decision, it feels as if you are free. You may take a moment where you're really trying to decide between one thing and another, and you deliberate for a very long time, and you think, well, I want this for this reason, I want this for another reason, and you go back and forth. It feels like a deliberation. And more than that, it feels like when you finally plunk down for one thing or another, that you have made that decision, that it was something that was under your control. So that's a very strong reason for why you might think the free will thesis is true. We feel free. In those moments where we think we're making a free choice, it feels from the inside as if no one is forcing us to make a decision. So that's one of the reasons you might think that the free will thesis is true. The other is that we treat ourselves and each other as if we are free. If you have a friend who does something bad, who lies to you or deceives you or does something that you just find really awful and it hurts you, you blame them and you want them to apologize. And we seek for people to either apologize for their actions or take responsibility for when they've done something wrong. And when they've done something good, we want to praise them. And we want to say that was a great job and good, thank you for doing that. And we want to praise them for the things that they've done that we think are good things. So praise and blame, when we reward or we punish, these are things that we do in our society and also our friendships and our social interactions. And underlying that, you might think, is this notion that we're free. So if you have a friend who's done something wonderful for you and you say, wow, thank you so much, that is just amazing, you're the best friend ever. And then you find out that this thing that they've done, they really only did because someone coerced them to do it, but they didn't really feel like they wanted to do it. Well, then you don't think that they've done something really noteworthy. Or if somebody has done something that's wrong and then you find out that they were under hypnosis or they had a gun to their head or they had no control, then we stop blaming them for the thing that they did that was wrong. And this happens in our legal system too, right? As soon as you find out, for example, that somebody robbed a bank, not because they were just a bad person who wanted to steal a bunch of money, but they're a kleptomaniac who might have something wrong with them, then we think that they enjoy or get a more lenient sentence. So we treat ourselves and each other as if we are free, and you can see that by the way that we treat each other, both in the legal system, both in your friendships, people that you know, and also your past self, right? So when we think we've done something wrong, we usually punish ourselves or blame ourselves, and when we've done something good, we reward ourselves. We wouldn't praise and blame and reward and punish if we didn't think we didn't have a choice in those actions. So, 2 reasons to think that the free will thesis is true is 1, we often feel free, and 2, we treat ourselves and each other as if we are free. But why should we think that the causal determinism thesis is true? So why should we think that 2 is true? Well, a lot of people think that 2 is true just because of our pseudo-scientific worldview. And by pseudo-scientific, I mean we don't have to be a scientist to think in scientific ways, so that's why it's pseudo-scientific. When we look out into the world and something happens, we look for a cause. If you were to see a rock barreling down a hill and it were to fall, and if it were to hit your car or something, then you would look for a reason for why it fell. You wouldn't think that it happened as some kind of miracle unless, of course, there's some story that leads to that. But when something happens, like a rock falling down a hill, we look for a reason for why it happened. Was it precariously placed? Was there a big gust of wind? Was it that somebody had pushed it? What was the reason for why it happened? And the fact that we always look for reasons why something happens is because we're looking for the cause. So very often the reason we think that the causal determinism thesis is true is because we don't think that things just happen in the world without causes. It would be very bizarre. You can imagine that if you walked into your bedroom one day and you saw this giant glowing orb just hovering in the middle of your room, and it's not attached to anything, and you don't know where it came from, and it's just hovering there, glowing, you would be incredibly perplexed, and you would probably ask people, well, how did it get there? And you might call a team of scientists, and you might call your local newspaper or news source, and you might ask them, how did this get here? And you can imagine if lots of people investigated it, and they looked, and they're like, you know what, there's just no cause. It just is here. That would be not only incredibly unsatisfying, but unbelievable. Now, it may be that there is a cause and we don't know it, right? And in this class, we've talked about the difference between metaphysics, there being something that is, versus epistemology, what we know. It very well could be that there's a reason that that glowing orb is there and we just don't know what it is. But to think that there's no cause at all boggles the mind in such a way that it just almost seems incomprehensible. And so that speaks to, if the causal determinism thesis were false, it may mean that there are things out there that don't have any causes at all. They're uncaused events. And that just seems unintuitive. So the reason we think that the causal determinism thesis is true is because of our scientific worldview. Right. Our pseudoscientific worldview, we just think that there is a reason for why things happen, and reasons we think are causes. Finally, the last one, why would we think that 3 is true? And this might be better left as a diagram. So when you're trying to think of why 1 and 2 are incompatible, if you think that the incompatibilism thesis is true, I said a bit of this a little bit ago, the last lecture. But imagine that you are hanging out watching this lecture, and as you're watching this lecture, you are enjoying a cup of coffee. And you want to figure out why it is that you got a cup of coffee, because here's the thing. You do think that you had a choice in the matter. In fact, let's imagine even if it wasn't the case and you just got up and you got a cup of coffee because it's a total automatic thing and you don't even think about it. But imagine you had a moment this morning where you thought, okay, I'm going to choose to get a cup of coffee over a cup of tea or water or whatever. It's been a stressful couple of weeks, and these are weird times. I need my cup of coffee, so you chose to get some coffee. So let's imagine that according to the free will thesis, you chose to get a cup of coffee. And let's also imagine that this is a free choice. I choose coffee. So we're just going to imagine that this is one of those things that you choose voluntarily, and this is a free decision. So assuming that 1 is true, You do sometimes act freely, and we're assuming that in this particular case, it's to get that cup of coffee. But then if we think that 2 is true as well, then we have to think that there is a cause for this choice. Now, normally when you think about what causes your choices, it can come down to at least 2 things: your beliefs and your desire, right? You believe that if you get coffee, then you will wake up and you might be able to survive and last through my lecture, and also you desire it. And so you believe that if you get some coffee, it may do some good and keep you up, and you also desire it. And those 2 things might be able to get you to walk across the room and get yourself some coffee. So let's say that this choice was caused by a belief and desire. A belief that getting coffee is good for you, it might help you, or a desire that you just wanted it. So according to 1, this is your free choice. According to 2, it is caused by a belief and desire. But if 2 is true, then this thing too also must have a cause. So what caused your belief that if you got coffee, you'd be able to survive listening to this lecture, and your desire for coffee? What caused those things? Well, I put a question mark because who knows, but maybe it's habit, right? Maybe you're just a coffee drinker, and so you desire coffee because you've built up this desire for coffee over a long period of time, and it's just a habit. Maybe it's genetics. Maybe you're just kind of built that way, that you just desire coffee. Maybe it's society. Right? Maybe it's your own personal history. Maybe it's something that you intentionally said, look, I'm going to be a coffee drinker, and you just decided to make your life such that when you got to college, you're going to start drinking coffee, and so you began this thing, and who knows where that started, right? So it could be a whole range of things. But if we think that the causal determinism thesis is true, even these things, whatever cause we give it, it has to have a cause too. And what's going to happen is if you start asking what the causes of society, genetics, habit, and these huge things, what the cause of those are, you're going to get to explanations that go way beyond you. You're going to get to things like your parents. Oops, sorry. You're going to get to things like your parents. You're going to get to history, right? You're going to get to the world before you were even born. Why it is that you have the genetics that you do goes way back to your parents and their parents and their parents and this huge genetic line. Why do we live in the society that we are in, and why does it have the sort of pressures that it does, and why does it tell people, hey, you want to pay $4 for a cup of coffee? Well, that has a lot of history, and a lot of that is something that has been around way before you were here. So what happens is when we start asking for the causal chain of why it is that we eventually chose coffee today, we get to reasons and causes and explanations that were around and exist before you. And if that's right, if your desire for coffee this morning is just the end result of this long causal chain that started way before you, again ignoring the very first cause, but it just needs to go far back, then the sense that you chose this freely goes away. It seems to undermine the fact that you chose this freely if you start counting all the reasons and causes and events that are in this huge causal chain that began way before you were born to end up with the event of you choosing your coffee. As soon as you recognize that huge causal chain of events, it seems that there is no choice anymore. It undermines the fact that you did it freely because you're counting on all these things that just seems like you are the result of this huge causal chain. That huge long argument of taking an instant where you think that it's a free choice and also saying, okay, well, if the free will thesis is true, then I chose this freely. But if the causal determinism thesis is true, then there's a huge long causal chain that caused it. What the incompatibilism thesis says is, if that's right, these are incompatible. You can't freely choose to have your coffee and also admit there's this causal chain. What 3 is saying is that you can have 1, the causal chain, or the other. You have free will and free choice, but you can't have both. And that's the argument, is to point out, okay, assume you have a free choice and assume there's a causal chain, and notice how the causal chain seems to undermine the free choice. So it looks like when we say I choose something, that I sometimes act freely, that if you also think that there's a causal chain of events that you're the end of, that that's incompatible. At least that's what the incompatibilism thesis says. Okay, so quickly. The reason the free will paradox exists is because we have three claims, all of which seem compatible. All of which seem intuitive. What I've done just in these 15 minutes is go through why each of them seems true. One seems true because we feel free, we treat ourselves and each other as if we are free. This is just how we work. Two seems true because of our scientific worldview. That's just how we seem to interact with events. And three seems true because if you try and get the free will thesis and the causal determinism thesis together and you try and assume they're both right, the one seems to undermine the other. So each of these seems right, but you can't embrace all three, so one of them has to go.